the bird emergency. It's Monday. That means it's Monday with Holly, Dr. Holly Parsons, the manager of the Urban Birds program at Birdlife Australia. Hello, Holly. How are you?
Hi. Cold. I'm
Yeah,
very cold.
it's only a few days until the start of winter here in the southern part of the world, and yes, it's kicked in. Um,
Well and
part
truly.
two of part two of Fairywrens today, Holly. So
Yes.
that means we've got this bloke with us. Hi, Joe.
Hey, Grant. Good to be back.
Dr. Joe Welklin, of course, who is one of the driving forces behind the Fairywren project. And we spoke 2 weeks ago about fairy wrens. And we sort of zipped through the 10 species that are found in Australia. There are others in New Guinea, but we only talked about Australia. But today we're talking about a paper that Joe and his Fairywren project partner, Alison Johnson, put together about hybridisation. So, Joe, why do we care?
Well, there's many reasons to care about hybrids. For birders, they're interesting just because they're unique. Hybrids are generally rare among birds, and so to actually find a hybrid in nature is a cool find, and that's something that other birders will often flock to just to see what it looks like and to add it to their list.
Joe,
Uh,
can I pull you up on something? I read your paper, right? I read the
uh-huh.
paper. 16% of species hybridize. So
So
it's not that special, is it?
there's a sort of debate. There's two levels of hybridization there. So one is just the species that we know can hybridize. So you're right or we know at least 16 species can hybridize. 16% of species of birds can hybridize. Um, but when we think about seeing birds in nature, actually seeing a hybrid in nature is fairly rare. So like a birder out birding, traveling around, for them to actually find a hybrid, that doesn't happen too often, even though we know many species actually can hybridize. And it's probably the actual number of species that can hybridize is probably much greater than 16%. But in general, when we're out birding, actually finding a hybrid is usually rare.
Now, hybrids are often thought of as being not able to be fertile, or that they can't pass on some of the features that they display if they are able to then to breed. Tell us about what is important or significant, perhaps significant's a better word, about hybrids when they are not just a one-off. Why is it important?
Yeah, there's multiple reasons. You're right that sometimes when species hybridize, the hybrids cannot pass on their genes, and they're sort of inviable. Other times, yeah, sometimes that happens immediately. So sometimes hybrid offspring will just die; they won't hatch out of the egg. But other times it can be really important if you get, say, a species that forms or two species that form a hybrid zone where they meet. If their ranges overlap and they hybridize within that range, you can sometimes get the passing of genes back and forth across those two species. And that's really important for thinking about evolution and how species can gain new traits.
So, where are we, Joe? There we are. Sorry.
You're good.
So, uh, are there sort of rules in like genetic rules with hybrids in what will occur if if the hybrids are male, if the offspring are male, or if they're female? Like, can you tell us anything about what will happen when certain species, and perhaps we can look at some of those examples in the paper,
Mhm.
or is it a game of chance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't, for many species, I would say we don't really know because we don't get to see hybrids too often. there are some certainly some examples where we do know a lot, where any species we can breed domestically, say um, like horses and donkeys. We know a lot about mules and the other hybrids that can form from those, but for wild bird species, yeah, we don't know too much about the consequences. But we do know usually when two bird species hybridize, the hybrid, if it's viable and it can grow up to be an adult, it will show traits from both species often. So in the Fairywrens that we saw, they had traits from both the parent species. And for males versus females, it really depends on sort of the male and female phenotypes of those two parent species. And so for female Fairywrens in particular, they're often not ornamented. They're or like as ornamented as the males, we can say. There are some exceptions. Say like the lovely Fairywren has really extravagant blue. Female has extravagant blue across the top of her head and a little bit under her neck and back. But for most female Fairywrens, they're very brown, and so identifying a hybrid Fairywren as a female, it would be very difficult since the females are so similar across species. But when you get males that hybridize, in some species, you'll start to see these the combination of the traits. It looks like a mishmash of the two species as the hybrid.
Holly, do you think you've ever seen a hybrid Fairywren?
I don't think I have. Very honestly, I didn't know it was a thing. I had not really contemplated the fact that there would be that hybridization, which is probably a bit silly of me, to be honest, because we do see it in, some cockatoos and things. You can occasionally get wild, corellas and sulphur-crested cockatoos, for example, or galahs with either of those combinations. So I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe I have. And like Joe said, female Fairywrens, at least, the East Coast ones often look really similar. So, just identifying them as being one species or another is often hard enough, let alone contemplating that maybe a hybrid thrown in there. So is it more common, Joe, that you would get, depending on how related the Fairywren species are to each other, is that where the more closely related is where you're more likely to get a hybrid?
That's a good question. Probably not. Maybe, but probably maybe not. So if you think about I'm trying to think of other examples in the bird literature because we don't know. We only have a couple examples of hybridization in Fairywrens. Where we have seen hybrids in Fairywrens, they've always been not the most closely related species as far as I can remember or think. Yeah. So for example, redback Fairywrens and white-winged Fairywrens are very closely related. And their ranges of butt come right up next to each other. It's sort of a transfer from redbacks in one area to white wings in the next area. So they cross the road sometimes from one another. And we don't have any evidence of hybrids in those, but we do have evidence of redbacks and superb Fairywrens, which are much more distantly related. So you might think of those sister species, like redbacks and white-winged Fairywrens, they probably evolved to recognize each other as not the same species. So there isn't, because often there is a negative effect of hybridization. Often hybrids are not viable, and so both species and often species in general should be selected to not hybridize with one another. So I think I don't know the hybridization literature that well, but I would guess that it's often not sister species. It's often slightly more distantly related species, but I could be wrong.
Now, the reason we're talking about hybrids is because you've recently published this paper with Ellison. So, while I scroll back and sort of get to the start of the paper, do you want to tell us what the purpose of the paper was and what your general findings were, and then perhaps we can step through it and have a look at all the nice pictures.
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying the hybrid or the paper was led by Alsa and I, but really most of the work in terms of the hybrids themselves came from photographers and birders from around Australia, mostly around the east and south coast, because that's where they found these birds. And we also worked with Andrew Black, who's an ornithologist from South Australia, who used to work at the South Australian Museum. And he's an expert on fairywrens and hybridization. And he actually wrote the book on grass wrens. If you're interested in grass wrens, he has a great book. So we worked with Andrew and many photographers from these different locations that had seen these hybrids. And so we first sort of heard about these hybrids through Facebook. A guy named Martin Ross messaged us on Facebook about a hybrid in Gladstone, Australia. And we thought that was amazing because we hadn't seen one before. And there were only a couple published accounts of hybridization in fairywrens before this point. And so we worked with Martin to start describing this one. And as we were describing this first hybrid, another guy emailed us. Glenn Roman emailed us from about a hybrid in just west of Brisbane in Queensland.
And that's what we're looking at on the screen now.
This is the one in Brisbane. Yeah, this is actually an older one we found then through social media. So the goal of the paper was to document or to see how common hybridization was in fairywrens, and to document up front the records we do have of hybridization fairywrens, because before this there'd only been a couple just short little papers or notes about hybridization fairywrens of some older sightings. And so we wanted to sort of document and take stock of how common this was in fairywrens and what are the species that we've seen hybridize.
Okay, now people won't be able to read the fine print of this one, but these A and B, let me just describe them. Probable hybrid male, 19th of December 2006, is A. Fledgling fairywren in the hybrid males group, so possibly offspring of A. Is that correct?
Possibly, yeah. We can't know for sure.
No, without doing the genetics, obviously.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah, so that was seen on the 5th of January 2007. C and D are appearing. So C, fairywren in atypical non-breeding plumage on 15th of June 2007. D, the more ornamental male in breeding plumage on the 17th of October in 2007. So that's that pair there. And then E and F, less ornamented male in breeding plumage on 17th of October 2007, and a probable hybrid male on 8th of August 2008. So A to C were videos from Greg Nye, and D to F were from Peter Schramek. Or Schramek. I'm not sure which one is correct pronunciation. Joe, you'll know that, won't you?
We just emailed Peter and I, so I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry if I got it wrong, Peter, but you know who you are. So Joe, the thing I'd like you to talk about is how you confirmed all of these reports. So you've got the social media reports, but then have you gone back and checked any sort of official records, like official birdwatcher records? How did you do it?
So we were as official as we could be. Ideally, we would have gotten blood samples from all of these birds and run the genetics on them to actually show that they have the genotypes, or like a mixed genotype of these two species. So the birds you were showing before there, that was a a hybrid between a red-backed fairy-wren and a superb fairy-wren. And in the paper, to be safe, since we don't have the genetics, we refer to all the hybrids as probable hybrids. And so we think based on their plumage, because it's so different from each of the parent species, we're almost like, we're in like 99% sure they're hybrids. It'd be really unlikely that one of these parent species would just grow these different ornaments, these different plumage patches, sort of out of nowhere. It's possible, but it's very unlikely that this would have just happened by chance in one of the parent species without any hybridization. So that was as official as we could be. And I forget the rest of your question. Did I answer it, or was there more to it?
Yeah, did you cross-reference with, eBird or anything else? Because you got most of these tips from social media, I think, from Facebook groups. Is that?
Yeah, so most of it was from social media, and we did go in then to eBird as well. That's actually how I found Greg Nye, who took those first photos and videos of the hybrid he showed there. That one's from Brisbane. I actually downloaded all of eBird's data on Fairywrens, which we do regularly anyway for the Fairywren project. But then I did a search for hybrid just in any of the species comments for anybody's eBird checklist. And Greg Nye's name popped up as another birder had written something like, Greg Nye said there was a female Fairywren or a hybrid Fairywren here in the past. And so I looked up then Greg Nye on social media and tracked him down through that. And we started corresponding there, and he sent us these photos, and he sent us videos as well.
It feels like Ancestry.com for Fairywrens, really.
It very much was so. Yeah, that's not even the worst one. Like, that was through eBird and Facebook, but in one of the other ones, it's the only I found a name, but then the only way I could find to contact Hannah, was through LinkedIn. So the only reason I have a LinkedIn account is because I needed to contact Hannah, who had photos of these hybrids, or this, it was redback Fairywren or superb Fairywren where it shouldn't have been. So.
Amazing.
So Joe, the next one in the paper is the white-winged by superb Fairywren from Thunder Swamp. Do you want to talk about that one next?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just pop those shots up. So it's quite a handsome bird, this one, but this is in Victoria. So tell us about this one.
This one's from a bit north and maybe a little bit west of Melbourne, I think. It's a sort of small nature preserve, I think, called Thunder Swamp. Greg License took these photos back in 2014, I think. And he saw a couple birds that looked like this at Thunder Swamp over two trips he went. And he birds there pretty often, he says, but he only saw these birds there these two trips. And these birds look like they're a combination of a superb Fairywren and a white-winged Fairywren. So they're different from a superb Fairywren because they're missing sort of the black eye line between the eye and sort of the back of the head. There's sort of continuous blue through that cheek. And their blue is much more sort of drab than a bright superb turk or like teal or light blue.
It's deeper. It's quite a deep blue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a much deeper blue, like a white-winged Fairywren. And you can see they have a little bit of a wing patch. It's not very white on this individual. It's more gray, but it's a little bit more of a wing patch than a superb Fairywren would have as well.
It's pretty cool, isn't it? Like that. I'm not sort of saying the hybridization is really cool. I reckon that Greg was so on the ball, and that on two different trips he's seen what looks like the same birds. So they're obviously in that same sort of family group or colony or marauding mob or however they've got themselves organised. But I wonder what happened. I wonder what was the
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think if so I've looked on Google Maps at Thunder Swamp in the past, and it seems like it's in that area of Victoria. It seems like there's a lot of farmland, and there's sort of like these nature preserves interspersed within this farmland, and so who knows? They could have disappeared into the fence lines between the farmland, or they could have lost their habitat, and who knows? It's hard to tell.
And is the next ones we've got Gladstone, but in the paper you're referring to Oakey. So are the Gladstone ones the photos that I'll pop up in a minute, which are red-backed and superb Fairywren, probable crosses from Gladstone, which are let's see, Martin Ross, Deb Walker, and Tracy Welburn. Are they all the same 2020, 2021? Are they the same birds that we're looking at from the same group? And are they from the Oakey group? Because I don't think Oakey's terribly close to Gladstone, is it? So,
no, they're separate from the Oakey
okay.
group. That's a white-winged and superb Fairywren hybrid,
Okay,
and the Gladstone ones are a red-backed and superb Fairywren hybrid.
Okay, so we don't, in the paper, we don't have pictures of the Oakey group. Is that right?
I think there are. It should be
just looking for those.
A little bit down. It should be figure 6, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
It's a ways down.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Yep. I was hoping we were going through the chronological order, but here we are. Let's do Gladstone then, because they're next. They're pretty striking looking birds.
These are some of the best photos we have, of these hybrids, because the one from Brisbane that we showed before of the red-backed and superb Fairywren hybrid, that was back in before 2010, so the camera technology wasn't quite as good as we have now. And some of these are from Martin Ross, some are from Tracy Welburn, and some from Deb Walker, and they are really sharp photos. We were really impressed when we received these.
A, B, and C from Martin Ross. That's great, isn't it? The one with the chain mesh fence. Look how snappy that is. And it's a pretty vivid chestnut wing patch, isn't it?
I would say red, but I'm biased because when I think of chestnut, I think of like a variegated Fairywren wing patch, which is much more brown.
But they're probable red-backed and superb hybrids. So then D, what have we got? D molt plumage on May 14, 2021, and that is from Deb Walker, which is that one with the beautiful blue sky in the background. Mm-hmm. And then E and F are from Tracy Welburn, and they are June 2021. So they're the most recent, all from a similar location, though, near Gladstone. So this is that. Sorry, Joe. Are you thinking that without the genetic material to be able to test, are you thinking that this is like an ongoing lineage in this group?
Sort of, yeah. So for these, we think for that figure, we think that's all one bird. So the photographers and Martin in particular did a really good job of following these birds around throughout the season, over at least a year, maybe 2 years now. And we think there's 2 hybrids in Gladstone at least, or currently. So there's the one we just showed there's a more ornamented hybrid, which is the one we just showed, and there's a less ornamented hybrid, which just has less of the fancy blue and black and red plumage. It has more brown plumage than the other hybrid does. So we've been calling that one the less ornamented hybrid. This is the less ornamented hybrid. Yeah. And so Martin and the other photographers have been following these individuals around, and their territories are quite small. Martin has kind of mapped them out a bit in another paper published in the same issue of Australian field ornithology. If you go find this paper on Australian field ornithology, you can also find Martin's paper just right next to this one.
Yeah, and I will link to those because it's much easier to do than to go chasing through. And they're also available on BirdLife Australia. They have an article about hybrid fairy wrens as well, so you can find them through there. I might just, before we move on, is for those who are watching, if you've got any questions that you would like to know the answers to, or any comments, just put them in the comments. It's pretty easy if you're on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook, and I'll get a little notification and we'll talk about them. Joe, the following around of this group, do we know if, or of this individual that would have belonged to a group, do we know if there was any breeding that has occurred with this particular male, the less ornamented male at Gladstone?
I think both males actually paired with a female redback fairywren. So they at least paired, and it seemed like they formed a breeding pair that defended a territory. And one of the individuals, one of the hybrids, I forget which one it was, his female built a nest, laid some eggs, and then the council came through and slashed the grass that they were breeding in, and the nest got destroyed. So yeah, we don't know the results of that nesting attempt because it failed. But they at least, they did find a female and they paired with her. Whether they mated with her is a different question, because fairy wrens are known for their extra-pair copulations, where both females and males will go mate with other females and males in different breeding groups. And so a female presumably could have, if she didn't think her male was very attractive, she could go mate with other males entirely and not mate with her male at all. So we don't know, about those offspring at all.
So the ones I've put up now, Joe, are the Police Creek at Gladstone, 2012 and 2013. So we've got a male red-backed fairy wren in illustration A, or in photo A, with a female superb fairy wren, and B is a female superb fairy wren with a second female or juvenile superb fairy wren, or a hybrid red-backed by superb fairy wren. Picture A, Alicia Newport, B, Hannah Bush. What's the story about those birds?
Yeah, this is the really interesting part, because the female superb fairy wren there, we think is probably the ancestor of these hybrids that we've just shown in Gladstone, because we think that because the superb fairy wrens are really rare around Gladstone. The closest sightings were something like at least 20 kilometers away. I forget what the exact number was.
Wow.
Of superb fairy wrens. And so somehow this individual just appeared, migrated to, dispersed to Gladstone, and presumably couldn't find a male superb fairy wren because there were none there. And so then paired with this male red-backed fairy wren, we think, based on the photo. So since they're right next to one another, they're probably allopreening one another, or in the process of doing that. And so they were probably a breeding pair, but we don't know for sure. But that's the evidence we have. So it's really cool, because most times when you find a hybrid bird in nature, you don't really know the story behind it. You just know that these two species mated and produced this offspring, and that's it. But here we think we know sort of how this event started. So back in 2012, we think this female superb fairy wren somehow dispersed into this population and probably mated with this redback fairy wren to produce the first hybrid. And we don't know if the hybrids we saw are the first ones or later down this line of hybridization. It's impossible to tell without genetics, and even with genetics, I'm not sure. It might be really hard to tell.
Um, what would you need to do, Joe, in like what further work would need to be done to settle some of these issues about how long the the hybridisation has occurred, and then some of those issues about dominance and regressiveness and which traits would endure and which wouldn't.
Yeah, we would just have to sort of keep watching the hybrids, and so that is being done. So Martin and the other photographers are watching the other or these hybrids still, which is really cool. So they're going to be able to track hopefully their life cycles and see if they can breed again this coming breeding season, or if they die off and if they don't breed again, or if this lineage just continues and we keep having hybrids in this location. Um, it would also be really cool to get genetics from these individuals. So if we could take a small blood sample from these hybrids, we could sort of we might be able to figure out whether who was the mother and who was the father in terms of species, whether the female superb Fairywren was the mother, or if the mother was a redback Fairywren. Yeah.
So with the genetics, the blood work that would need to be done, Joe and Holly, I'm guessing you might know the answer to this. What what would it cost to do, like um, uh, per per sample, or what would a budget that you would need to be able to do that project be in the region of? I'll throw it open to both of you for that.
I don't know about lab costs. I think Joe might have a better idea than I do, but it would involve, having some people with certain banding licenses out in the field, misnetting for the birds and taking those very, very tiny little blood samples from the legs of the fairy wrens, a tiny little drop. They don't have much to give.
Nope.
And probably banding the birds as well, so there can be a really easy way to ID them all with unique colour bands. And then I'm not sure about how much it would cost to run the sample.
I think it really depends how far you want to go. So if you wanted to, theoretically, if you had a blood sample, you could probably get the whole genome of each individual, and from there that could tell you a lot of information. It would be really cool to do that because you could compare the genomes of the hybrids to the genomes of the parent species, and that would start to allow you to figure out what gene regions might be behind some of these different plumage phenotypes. Because think of a redback Fairywren, a male redback Fairywren doesn't have any blue at all on it. But this hybrid has those blue cheek patches and that blue forecrown patch. And so if you compared the genome of the hybrid to the genome of a normal redback Fairywren, you might be able to start to see which regions might underlie these differences or these blue patches. That's something that people have been doing in birds, especially in warblers in the United States. Hybridization among warblers is not uncommon, so they've been sort of using these hybrids to narrow or zoom in on these genome regions that are underlying these different plumage traits. And so that would be really cool to do. That getting a genome of an individual bird would be a fair bit of money. Probably less than $10,000 each individual, but like less than $10,000 each for each individual. But I'm not familiar with these costs. It could be as little as $2,000, as much as $10,000 potentially.
Yeah, I only ask because I'm kind of thinking that to make it a worthwhile project is you need to find out more than just one or two birds and maybe one or two locations. So I'm thinking that to make it worthwhile, you probably need $100,000, wouldn't you? So
it depends. I don't know. I think there have been some cool stories with warblers, just from one individual. They are with there's one story of a warbler that they were able to trace back that there's been 2 instances of hybridization that led to this warbler being created. So it's possible, but yeah, it is a bit expensive.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's the type of cost that would be, or the number of replicates that you would need if you were doing like an ecological focused project. When you're doing a genome sequencing, I think you can tell so much from, you know, a smaller amount of birds that is applicable at a larger scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joe, look at this.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay,
amazing.
good. Martin's commenting. Hi, Martin.
So, Joe, do you want to read that one out?
Yeah, Martin Ross, who is the photographer from the Gladstone hybrids, those 2 hybrids there, and he's the one that first alerted us to hybrids and Fairywrens. He says, hi, in regards to the breeding of the more colorful hybrid in Gladstone, I have photographed the male with 3 uncolored birds family group. Cool. So maybe, and Martin, I forget, is that the one that had the nest that failed, that got slashed by the council? Maybe you can comment again. But maybe they re-nested. So if Fairywrens do fail a nest, at least in redback Fairywrens and superbs presumably as well, if they fail a nest, they will usually try again.
Yep.
So that's really exciting, Martin. If that male does have a couple young birds with him, that would be really interesting. If those are his offspring, that would be cool to watch. So if there are some males in that family group, okay, cool. So he must have re-nested. So that's great. And that's exciting. So if there are some males and young males in that family group, they shouldn't disperse too far. Usually redback Fairywrens only disperse maybe a couple territories over, is pretty common. So it's likely that those hybrids or those young males will show up nearby. So keep watching and keep your expanding your range a bit come breeding season when they're all molting into their bright plumage. There might be some more hybrids then. That's exciting.
And you know what else is exciting? That Martin has been saw what we were doing on Twitter or YouTube and or on the website and joined in. So that's the whole point. Thanks, Martin. Welcome aboard. Great to see you.
We should have had him on too.
Now, well, there's nothing to stop us doing it again, is there? Holly will talk about Fairywrens at any opportunity.
Any chance I get.
We haven't done the superb city wrens yet, so we've got another valid excuse to put an episode of Fairywrens together. So, and we haven't been able to speak to Alison yet, Joe. So there's plenty of opportunities to talk Fairywrens. Now I've got the next lot, which are the white-winged superb Fairywrens from Oakey, lined up. So have you got your memory plugged in for those ones, Joe?
Yeah, so these were found by Glenn and Karen Roman. They're based over on the coast, but they do birding trips in towards the interior. And so these are just near Toowoomba. I forget exactly where Oakey is. Maybe it's just west of Toowoomba, a bit west of Brisbane. And Glenn first, saw this bird and I think the photograph in A first. So that's the male and his full breeding plumage. You can see he sort of has the blue head and a little bit of the blue cheek of a superb Fairywren, and then a very white shoulder patch there, which is unique. And it's a smaller shoulder patch than a normal white-winged Fairywren. And Glenn took all these photos, and he was able to watch this male sort of progress through his molt into non-breeding plumage.
And how good is pick D? Where it's a ripper, Glenn. The bird's just launched off the perch, but hasn't quite got the wings out yet. That's a beauty. Let's see.
I'm finding E really interesting. You can see the black behind the ear. It's being really distinct still there.
Non-breeding plumage. That's February 2021. And the photo next to it, F, is in June, as goes into breeding plumage. So this is all the same bird. Is that correct?
We're pretty sure it's all the same bird. Theoretically it could be different birds, but it was in the same spot each time, Glenn said. And The ornaments look the same, except for it's really interesting if you look at F, his shoulder patch in the second year that Glenn saw him, his shoulder patch there, the white is much darker. It's much more gray, which is actually very similar to the shoulder from the birds that Greg License saw down in Victoria.
And the crown or the back of the ear coverts is it may just be the light, but it's slightly less defined as well, the black. So
it could be a different individual, or maybe his plumage changed. I don't think we know. Yeah, we think it's one bird, but we can't be 100% without the genetics.
Magnificent. Now I'll just take that out again. So the next ones are pretty interesting. You've got the parent species.
Oh yes,
Samson Vale. Let's just go over this bit and we'll talk about what it all means. So
these are the parent species. Just we wanted to provide reference photos.
Yeah.
And so there's a normal redback fairywren. You can see there's no blue on the face or on the cheeks, or on the crown or on the cheeks, and it's got much more redder back than the hybrids did. There's much more red on its back, but it's got the similar.
Much more extensive.
The black to our eyes, without doing any photospectrometry, is pretty similar to the superb fairywren there in B. And that guy, the superb fairywren there, has lots of that sky blue on his cheeks and that crown, and sort of a blue-black breast. And then C, you've got a normal white-winged fairywren male in breeding plumage. He's got that big white wing patch where most of his coverts on his wing are white, and a couple of his flight feathers near his body are white. And then D is another example. That's a photo from a previous paper published by Peter Haynes. He found this bird in South Australia, which we also think is a cross between a superb fairywren and a white-winged fairywren, based on the birds that were nearby.
Yeah, and they're the parent species, the examples that you provided here, are very, very far away from each other. So the red-backed Samson Vale, the superb male, is in Port Campbell in southwestern Victoria, and then the white-winged fairywren is Cunnamulla, which is the far southwest of Queensland. So just to give an example of how different the normal fairywren species in those far-flung locations are. So that comes up, sort of brings us back to, let me take that off while I scroll, back to that distribution map that we were talking about, which I think you need to talk to now, Joe, which shows the normal distributions of those three species, and then where hybrids have been seen. So I'll pop that up, and you can tell us all about that. And let me make that the full screen. There we are.
Yeah. So the one on the left there is showing the distribution of redback fairywrens and superb fairywrens. And so the redbacks are in the red points, and the blue is the superb fairywrens. And the yellow is where both species have been seen at the same location. And we got these data from eBird. So these are just sightings where people have seen these species. So this doesn't represent like the total entirety of their range. Obviously, there's lots of zones of open space between those points. And so there's probably, each species probably goes between those zones as well. This is just from eBird data that we know people have seen these birds there. And so that's what we used just to represent the ranges. And so then the black points are showing where these hybrids have been found. So the point number 1 is an old record from, I think, 1980 Yeah, from Malcolm Wilson. That's near Bowenville, Queensland. That's pretty far into the interior of Queensland from Brisbane, and um, that's on the edge of the Redback Fairywren range. Um, and then point two is right in pretty much downtown Brisbane. It's from I think Moorhen Flats Recreation Area in Brisbane, and that's right in the middle of essentially both species ranges. So redback fairywrens are in and near Brisbane. They're not in the city nearly as much as superb fairywrens are, and superb fairywrens are very much common in the city. And then point three is from Gladstone, the last birds we were or the last of this cross we were talking about, where Martin was talking about his photos and observations. That's on the edge of the superb fairywren range, where that it was really odd to see that superb fairywren that far north. And then on the right, it's showing the same thing for white-winged fairywrens and superb fairywrens. So the white-winged fairywrens are sort of an outback, a desert specialist. They're much more in the interior of Australia. And so point four is showing the previous observation from Peter Haynes that we showed before, which is on the edge of the maybe both species ranges, I forget right now. And then point five is from the observation from Greg License, the Victoria observation from Thunder Swamp. And that is where that's on the edge of the white-winged fairywren range. And point six is on the edge of the white-winged fairywren range up near Oakey, Queensland.
Amazing, amazing. Now, the thing that I am interested in is we're talking about 3 species, but there are many others. So, do you think that anecdotally that they're all doing it? Are they all doing it, Joe?
I mean, it's certainly possible. We know for at least 2 other species, there's the variegated fairywrens and the purpleback fairywrens. They were recently split in the last couple of years. We know there is a narrow hybrid zone sort of on the Great Dividing Range for those 2 species. So those 2 species are certainly hybridizing, but not. It doesn't seem like much from genetic data, but there is some evidence of hybridization. But for the other species, I think it comes down a lot to just could we detect it if it was there? Like think about the other fairywrens in the chestnut-shouldered clade. So your variegated fairywrens, your purpleback fairywrens, your lovely fairywrens, and red-winged and blue-breasted. They're all much more similar to each other than the species we've shown hybridizing here. And so seeing them out in the field, seeing hybrids would be much more difficult since they're so much more similar. You'd have to have a really good eye. It's possible, but it would be difficult.
Holly, if you could design a fairywren hybrid, what would you be looking for?
Oh, I feel like I'm creating Frankenstein's monster. Oh goodness, there are so many. Can you imagine having the purple crown with white wing and a nice splendid fairywren chest? Maybe you could go all out with it. Really, it'd be interesting to know, the extent to which some of this hybridization is occurring and what it's being driven by. Like, is there a shortage of mates in some of these locations, and so that's what's forcing some of these birds to recognize or accept a partner that's but maybe not hitting all their criteria being the same species. That would be really interesting to know what the limitations are in each of those locations, because you certainly get where I am, superbs and variegateds coexisting at the same sites in a huge amount of locations. But I would suggest that there's probably no hybridization going on there because there doesn't need to be. There's ample opportunities to mate within the species. So it'd be really interesting to look at more of those sort of border locations where there's crossing of distribution, and seeing what the limitations are amongst those populations.
Yeah, we think you're right. So most of these hybrids, 5 out of the 6 that have been reported, come from at least one species range edge. So
Mm,
we think you're right. We think that one of these individuals, maybe a female, because females usually disperse further in fairy
mm.
wrens than males do, maybe a female has gone outside of her species' normal range and then not been able to find a normal mate.
Yep,
And so she says, "Well, good enough.
you'll do.
We'll see what happens."
That's right.
That's obviously,
Yeah.
yeah, anthropomorphizing, but but essentially that's what we think is happening, and that's been shown in ducks in maybe Argentina, and a lot in fish as well.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a known sort of, it's hypothesis or rule, like rule in quotations because it doesn't always happen, but yeah, that definitely a shortage of one species suitable mates can lead to hybridization.
Yeah.
The unique observation in our data set, though, is that the Brisbane hybrid, where it's really, there's superb fairywrens in the city and redback fairywrens at least near the city, not as common in the city. Um, that's it's really in the Brisbane's really though in the heart of both species ranges, or
Mm,
overlapping both species ranges. So there, our best guess is that maybe when the photographers were there, and when Greg and Peter and Brennick were there watching those hybrids, they didn't see any redback fairywrens except for one that we think was probably the female that led to that hybrid lineage. And so we think that maybe that female just ended up in the middle of the city, and there were no male redback fairywren hybrids or redback fairywrens around, and that may have led to hybridization, even though it was within both species ranges.
yeah, because their habitat requirements can be, well, superbs are, I guess, a bit more flexible and will tolerate urbanization a lot more than
Yeah.
redbacks. So yeah, that makes sense.
So she dropped her 6 foot rule, Holly. If we're going to anthropomorphize, let's go to the ridiculous. Now, Joe, it wouldn't be a normal kind of show if I didn't ask a scientist an absurdly unfair question,
Oh, of course.
because it's outside of what you've been studying. But uh, the Malurus genus exists in New Guinea and as well. So, are you aware of any hybridization between the species in New Guinea?
That's an easy question. No,
No.
but that doesn't mean it's not there. There's just
Okay.
less
Well,
coverage of.
okay. Well, the unfair question really is, Joe. Do you think it's happening in New Guinea? There we are.
Oh, I mean, it certainly could be. Yeah, like I think anytime you have two species ranges that don't overlap completely, where one species could potentially get into another species range and out of its own range, I think you could get hybridization. Um, as long as the species aren't too far diverged. So you couldn't take a fairy wren and an emu probably, but you could probably take two fairy wrens and they could hybridize. So
I wonder if an Australian species would hybridize with a New Guinea species.
I think it could happen. So like the closest relative to redback fairy wrens is the white-shouldered fairy wren in New Guinea.
Okay.
And so they're even more closely related, we think, than redbacks and white wings. So we think, yeah, in evolutionary terms, we think the white wings were a sort of a reinvasion of New Guinea, because we think fairy wrens originally came from New Guinea, but we think they were sort of a reinvasion, as
Actually,
best we
Joe,
can tell. But it's hard to show that.
Joe, you've just made me realise what the next logical Fairy Wren project episode is, and Holly, I'm not sure if you've recently read the paper, but Joe and Alison and the team have talked about when the species diverged in geological timeframes. That's probably something that's really interesting to talk about next time, because we've talked in the last episode the 10 species and the kind of habitats that they currently currently live in. But wouldn't it be fun if we try and trace the evolutionary pathway of all the species? Are you up for that? What do you reckon?
Sure. To clarify, Alison and I haven't published on that, but there are, or like, we haven't done tests looking at that, but there's lots of literature, especially
Yeah,
from the older
you,
books. Yeah.
yeah.
But that
I should have been clearer. You've referenced plenty of
we've
work
referenced. Yeah.
that have been done. So it might be fun to, if we can't get those original authors. I don't know how far back in time they all go, but that might be a fun exercise. What do you reckon, Holly?
Oh, cool. I will learn a lot. I'm sure.
Well, we might leave it a little while so that people don't get all Fairywren out.
No
Is
such
that
thing,
possible?
Yeah,
Grant. No such thing.
but but Joe, let's put that in the planning pile, because I'd be really interested to actually look at. Probably nobody else in the world is, but I'd be really interested to sort of look at what those the divergent pathways have been, if anyone's done the work in New Guinea and on the Australian species, and to sort of see how frequently they split in the geological time frame. So,
Yeah.
I mean, why not?
I've got papers I can send you.
Yeah, well, I've got nothing to do, buddy. You know, except read historical papers. But yeah, but I think the next Fairywren one we've got to do, Holly, is to talk about some of the citizen science that is going on now. But
Yes, absolutely.
Joe, that brings me to where we talked about really early on the citizen science aspect of the Fairywren project. So let me just pop this one up. All these dots, what do they mean?
Yeah. So the hybrid project from the Fairywren project was sort of like an offshoot, something we didn't expect to actually work on, but something that came out of Martin initially emailing us. So thank you, Martin. That worked out really well. And so, but the Fairywren project, yeah, started as a project for Alison and I to work with birders from across Australia to try and understand how Fairywrens are responding to environmental variation. So that's both potential climate change, but also Australia without climate change. Just think of within a day, the variation in climate across Australia is massive considering all the different habitats from Tasmania all the way up to the Northern Territory. And there's Fairywrens across almost all those habitats, pretty much across the entire country. And so we have two sort of aims with the Fairywren project. One is to understand how plumage varies with environmental variation, specifically when males are producing their bright breeding plumage, and also how Fairywrens are responding in terms of cooperative breeding. So they have this really interesting social system where offspring will also often help their parents raise their siblings in later years before they go on to breed on their own. And so all of these points are showing locations from across Australia where people have sent us data on either plumage or group sizes of Fairywrens. And so you can see we have really good coverage on the East Coast, a little bit less coverage on the West Coast, which sort of tracks population levels and not as much from the interior. But if you're interested in, if you're already seeing Fairywrens, especially if you're using eBird already, it's really easy to send us data just by putting information in your comments of your Fairywren species on your eBird checklist. And if you're not using eBird yet, we have really hopefully clear instructions on our website how to get involved. And it's easy as going out, seeing the birds even in your backyard or your garden, and sending us information on the birds you're seeing and what they look like and sort of how many birds you're seeing at one time. If you have any questions, you can email us through our website or contact us on social media as well.
And of course, I'll link to all of those things, the eBird instructions especially, because that's important for all kinds of citizen science work. But you mentioned backyards, Joe. Thanks. You're doing my job for me. Um, you're always wanting people to tell you about what's going on in their backyards, aren't you, Holly?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we at Urban Birds, we have our Birds in Backyards program, which is, as the name implies, all about the birds that live where people live, and the communities as a whole. And so we have ways where people can do a 20-minute count of the birds in their garden using bird data. And they can also record what their gardens are like. So we use that information to look at what sort of habitats are different urban birds being attracted to, or where are they absent, and how are some of the behaviours that are going on in people's gardens influencing the types of birds that they get. So, what role might feeding play, for example, in the types of birds visiting your garden?
And of
So yeah,
course, we've got to
birdsinbackyards.net. All the instructions are up there.
and we've got to talk about Act for Owls, Act for Birds. We're still trying to get the pesticides off the shelves, the bad pesticides, rodenticides particularly, off the shelves. So there's some petitions you can get involved in. Easy links, birdemergency.com, Act for Owls, birdemergency.com, Poison petition, and Act for Birds. There's a whole bunch. Now, the only thing I want to say now, Joe and Holly, is I made you aware of this early on. There was this is quite a few years old now, but the Brolgas and the Saurus cranes have been hybridising in northern Australia, and the whole reason this is all interesting about hybrids is what might happen down the track. And the research from Charles Darwin University is sort of inconclusive because there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but there's a couple of options. We're going to have 3 species of crane: the Saurus crane, the Brolga, and this new result of hybridisation, or we can end up with the 2 that we've got, and the hybrids will eventually run out, die out, meet their evolutionary fate, or we're going to end up with 1 species, with all of them being mixed up in the great big melting pot. I'm using all the wrong terminology, of course, Joe, but I think you get the point. In the longer term, are we likely to alter from having 10 Australian species of Fairywren? In your opinion, obviously you haven't done the work. We haven't collected the bloods. We don't really know. But what's your gut feeling?
I think no, we're not likely to add on to our 10 from these events, but it is possible. I mean, I think the gut feeling is most hybridization probably doesn't result in too much, especially a new species being formed, but it can happen. So there's evidence from South America of 2 mannequin species actually hybridizing and forming a new species that doesn't really recognize either of the parent species as a suitable mate. And so it can happen, and it does happen. It's also happened in the Galapagos. From the Darwin's finches are really well known. But for these Fairywrens, it seems like we don't, from the little evidence we do have, it doesn't seem like these hybrids last too long, or like the hybridization event doesn't last too long. In all the instances we've seen, I think up to 3, maybe a 4 if I'm forgetting, hybrids produced in an event, and then they don't seem to continue. So all the older events, like the Brisbane location, nobody's seen a hybrid there since 2009 or 2010 or so. Greg, who birds the Victoria location, hasn't seen a hybrid there since 2014 or whatever, whenever he first saw the hybrids there. The Oki one is continuing, but so far there's only 1 bird there. And the Gladstone one is continuing. And from what Martin said, maybe there could be potential for more new hybrids there, which would be really exciting. So I think, if anything, the Gladstone hybrids have the most potential, but I think it seems unlikely given what we've seen already. But anything is possible. So yeah, the potentially more likely thing, but it's also still unlikely, is that you could get, when hybridization happens, since hybrids get a copy of both parents' genes, a copy of their mother's genes and their father's genes, if that hybrid back crosses to one of the parent species, so that means the hybrid individual mating with an individual of one of the parent species, sometimes you can get those genes from the other species intergressing, or sort of moving across species with all the intermating between the two species and the hybrids. And so at times that can result in beneficial traits. So there's been evidence before that's resulted in new traits occurring in these parent species. And then if that trait is beneficial, it might be selected for, or it might be more attractive to females. And so those males might get more matings, and then their offspring will get more matings, and you might see that trait move through the population. But that's also, even though it happens, it's probably unlikely. And so my guess is most of these will just be events that happen for a little while, hopefully multiple years, so people can go see the birds. But my guess is they won't last forever and won't have huge changes. But they could.
We'd need a whole new episode to sort of explain what happens with all that crossing and interbreeding coming back or going out, or and what might be features or qualities that would be selected for. But hey, maybe we can do that when we talk about our divergence over time, way back. Joe, what's next for the Fairywren project? I know it's sort of more a hobby for you now. I don't want to downplay its significance, but it's not the main part of what you're working on these days. But what would you like to do next with the Fairywren project?
Yeah, it's not my main focus at the moment, because in science you have to follow the funding. And so right now I'm working on mountain chickadees in the United States. But I hope to be back to Fairywrens full time eventually, hopefully in the next 3 or 4 years. But we are still working on the Fairywren project, Allison and I. It's just going a little bit slower than it could be, because we can't put our full time into it. But it is still moving, and we are using your data. And so the next project I'm working on is there's evidence from single populations that sometimes male Fairywrens can retain their bright plumage year round. It doesn't seem like it happens very often, and it doesn't seem like individuals can do this multiple years in a row. But it does seem like old individuals can sometimes, instead of molting into a brown non-breeding or winter plumage, they can sometimes stay in their bright breeding plumage year round. And that's interesting for sort of like breeding purposes, because female Fairywrens tend to pay attention to the males, to when males are producing that bright breeding plumage. And we've seen from at least 3 different species now, the males that produce that bright breeding plumage the earliest obtain the most matings come breeding season. So that trait, acquiring that bright breeding plumage early, is an attractive trait to the females. And theoretically, then, if a male keeps that bright breeding plumage year round, that's going to be even more attractive to the females. So that's what makes it an interesting trait. And so what we're trying to do next, we're sort of working on the plumage data and the group size data incrementally. And so our next step with the plumage data is to ask, is this year-round bright plumage occurring in more populations than just the couple we've studied? And sort of, does it cover like a whole species range, or does this just happening in part of a species range? So we're going to be using the plumage observations that birders have been sending in to the Fairywren project to look to see whether they're seeing bright males year-round or just during parts of the year. And so that'll be happening real soon. I'm about to start, I've almost got all of the data transcribed and proofed, And so the next month or so, I'll be starting analyses looking at that. And that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to that.
Fab. And mountain chickadees. What's the focus of the mountain chickadees work?
The mountain chickadee work, we're focusing on their cognition. So like their memory. So they're really interesting because they in the fall so we work really in the mountains here. In the summer it's really dry, and the winter there's many inches of snow, like over 100 inches of snow this past winter at the tops of these mountains where these birds are living, and they live in the mountains year round. And so in the winter, all the insects are either hibernating or dead. So the only food they have is pine seeds, but everything likes pine seeds. And so in the fall, these pine cones open, and the chickadees take the seeds out of the cones and they hide them all over the forest. One seed per location in the forest. And then come winter, they have to remember where they've hidden all of these pine seeds. And if they don't, they die. They can't make it through the winter. But if they can remember all these locations where they've hid pine seeds, they can make it through the winter because they can find their food. So we're studying their memory and how that allows them to live in these harsh conditions.
Well, Holly, I'm sure I speak for you. We want to talk about that when
Sure.
eventually.
That's amazing.
Eventually, yeah. That's
I can bring on some other people that know even more than me.
Yeah. Well, that's the great forum that we've got. We can get half a dozen people and talk about it. We see so much in the documentary world about all sorts of rodents who are moving, going and creating stores, and we've seen woodpeckers and whatnot doing it, and jays. So
Yeah.
it sounds like these guys struggle a lot harder than those other species. It'd be really interesting to find out about that down the road. But
Yeah.
But Joe, Fairywrenproject.org, thefairywrenproject.org is where people can catch up. If you can't remember that, thebirdemergency.com/fairywrens. It's really, really easy. Thanks, Joe, again. Dr. Joe Welklin.
Thank you for having me.
University of Nevada. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, mate. Holly, final comments, inspiration for you before we bid everyone adieu?
Oh, look, it was another, hour talking Fairywren, so I'm very happy. It's got the brain working. I'm ready to get a little bit more work done this afternoon and dream of Fairywren hybridisation tonight.
Fantastic.
Amazing stuff. Really interesting. Yeah.
I better tell people what's coming up on the Bird Emergency tomorrow. The 40 Spotted Pardalote episode with Dr. Sally Bryant is out. Later today, the Bird Emergency homepage is finally emerging, and it's I've got to say, it'll actually mean the site works, unlike how it has been for the last 2014. I think I first did something on the Bird Emergency. Wednesday, 2 live interviews to be mashed up later on to go into podcasts. Dr. Stacey Priestley, and this is a long-delayed Pint of Science interview, talking about the water quality and nutrient flows and where the nutrients come from and where they go in the Coorong, which is a really significant waterway inland bird habitat in South Australia. And 8:30 at night on Wednesday, Chad Criddle is speaking to me about the captive breeding programs that are happening in the in zoos South Australia, not University of South Australia. Plains Wanderers, especially. Ooh. So that one should be very, very interesting. So yeah, the way we do them live like this, and then I go and take time and turn them into a podcast as well. But if you prefer video, that's how to do them. Always, you can find them at thebirdemergency.com, and I'm always talking about them on Twitter. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Holly, again. 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking to you again. and
Yeah.
we'll have, who knows. I don't know yet whether it's going to be Fairywren's superb city Fairywren. No, I've got another thing in mind. So
All right.
we'll talk about
Excellent.
that and promote the. I was going to say the bejesus, but that's very Simpsons, isn't it? That's a Simpsons reference. Anyway, thanks everyone.
I want
Thanks
to
Joe.
give.
Thanks Holly.
Can I
Oh,
give one more shout out, Grant?
Yes,
I just want to
go
thank
for
again
it.
all
You
of
can
our
give as many as you
photographers and
want.
birders that made our hybrid Fairywren paper possible. They did all the work on the ground. Allison and I just wrote the paper with Andrew, the ornithologist from South Australia. So thank you to all you birders and photographers. If any of you are watching this later, you made
amazing.
this work, and yeah,
Yeah,
it was really fun working with you.
actually, we always forget to point out how important citizen science is. And I mean, I try and say it as often as I can. Volunteers are so important nowadays in science because, Joe, you referenced before, you got to follow the funding, and there's not enough of it. So yeah. Oh, Holly, this is only relevant for Australians, but who do you think's going to get the nod as the new Environment Minister?
Oh, God, I have no idea, Grant.
Yeah,
Don't know.
Tony Burke, he's been doing the job. What do you reckon?
Quite possibly. It's going to be very
Quite
interesting to
possibly.
see how policy shifts
It'll be very interesting to see what it's like
coming
having
forward.
an environment minister who might be interested in the environment. It'd be fabulous. Direct all complaints and everything to me, please, not to Holly and Mr. Joe. All right. Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Holly. For the fourth time, we're out of here. This has been the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams, thebirdemergency.com. Thanks. See ya.